Hello and welcome back to computer programming. All right, so for today's lab, we're going to be swinging back to the function calculator. All right, which means we have to talk about how do functions and arrays interact. All right, so as usual, we're going to start just by getting the sample file. All right, and as I'm getting this here, just note that the sample file isn't where you're going to be doing your work today. Instead, you're actually going to be doing the work in your original function calculator. What I'm downloading right now is just some sample code so we can talk about how all of this stuff works. Okay. So again, I'm going through the normal extract process. I'm going to drag this into my computer programming folder. And then, where is it? Array lab calculator 3. Okay. So let's take a look at what we have here in the sample code. Now, the first part of this sample code is just looking at square roots. And the reason that's important is because in the lab that you're working on, you're going to be calculating standard deviation. Standard deviation requires you to use a square root, so you have to know how that's set up in C++. So first thing is we have to add an include file. So when we actually start working on the lab, we're going to want to include CMath up at the top. And then once we've included CMath, doing a square root is as simple as SQRT. All right. So if I were to run this, oh, that weird thing happens that sometimes it doesn't work when I download it. All right, give me a second. Let me pause this and then we'll get it working. All right, so we're back. Now, if I run this, you're going to see that it's able to do square roots just fine. So, I start by putting 4 into I. I take the square root of that. It tells me that it's 2. I then switch I to 7. I take the square root of that. It tells me that it's 2.64575. Now, notice that I did make my variable float. It will work if this variable is type integer. All right, so if I go int I equals 4 and I run this, it's going to work just fine. All right. Now, the reason it works just fine is because all I'm doing is printing out the variable. All right. You do have to be careful because if you choose to use integers, it's possible that you're going to also try to save it in an integer value, and then that won't work. All right. And let me show you what I mean by that. So here I say I equals 7. I is now an integer. If I were to say I equals the square root of I, because I'm saving that back into an integer variable, the decimal is going to get cut off. So when I print it out, it's now going to tell me that the square root of 7 is just 2, all right, which isn't correct because we're using that integer value. All right, and actually saying the square root of 2 is 2 because I forgot that this was printing out the variable, not the actual number. So the square root of 7 is 2, which isn't actually correct because the decimal is getting cut off. So be aware that you can put integers into the square root function. That will work fine. But you have to be careful because if you start trying to save it in an integer variable, you might run into a problem when the decimals get cut off. So that's why I kind of made this float up at the start. And in your lab, when you're calculating standard deviation, you're going to need to make sure that the variable that's holding that answer is type float. Otherwise, you could end up getting the wrong result when decimals start getting cut off and you lose them halfway through the calculation. All right, so just something to keep in mind. To get a square root, we start by including CMath up at the top. That will give us access to SQRT. And then you just put whatever you want to take the square root of inside of the parentheses, and it'll do that work for you. Just be aware that you do have to be careful depending on the type of variable you're using. The decimals may or may not get cut off when you try to save that value. All right, so that's just a quick aside that you're going to need for the lab. Main thing I want to talk about is sending an array to a function. All right, so first things first, if you're sending an entire array to a function, this is the syntax that you're going to use. All right, when you're setting up your parameters, you still need to specify the type of the array. You still need to come up with a name for it. And then inside the function, when you're setting up the function in the function header, you're going to use empty brackets. All right, you don't have to specify the size of the array. You just have to say, hey, I'm sending you an array here. All right, and that's enough that the computer will know that it's about to receive an array and handle it correctly. Now, we do have to be careful because there's some implications when you send an array to a function. So I'm just going to continue on this program here and enter my 5 numbers. So I'm just going to enter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then it says, let's see what changed, 1, 22, 3, 4, 35. All right, so what's the implication there? What was the point of this? All right, well, the point of this was a couple of things. One, you'll notice that when I called the function, I'm sending it 3 parameters. Now, you can either send the entire array, which is what I'm doing in this parameter, or you can send individual pieces of the array, which is what I'm doing here and here. So this is me sending the entire array. This is me sending just element 0. This is me just sending element 1. All right, so those 3 are getting sent down to the function. This is receiving the full array. And then these 2 are receiving the individual pieces. Now, here's the part that's important. When you send an entire array, it is automatically by reference, which means any changes I make to ARR down here, like this line, are also going to affect my array up top here. All right. When you send an individual element, it's up to you. All right. You can either send it by value or you can send it by reference. When you send something by value, changes down here will not affect my array of 0 up here. When you send it by reference, changes that you make down here will affect my array of 1 up here. All right, and that's what this output is trying to show. All right, if we look at what happened here, we can see that the only values that are changed are 22 and 35. The others stayed the same. They're still 1, 3, and 4. All right, now let's take a closer look at the code. All right, by value, this variable by value is the one that received my array of 0. All right, so even though I added 10 to by value, my array of 0 stayed the same, which is why it is still 1 when I printed out the results. All right, my array of 1, I passed into by reference. So when I added 20 to it, all right, it's also going to affect my array of 1 up top, which is why this went to 22. Now, the entire array that I passed in here, my array, this is me passing in the entire array because notice I didn't use any brackets. It's just the name of the array by itself, got passed into ARR down here. So anytime I use ARR and I make a change to ARR, it's also going to affect the original array up top, which is why when I said my array of 4 and I added 30 to it, all right, that one went up to 35. All right, but I could change as much as I wanted to. And if I use ARR, this is automatically by reference. So any changes I make here are going to affect the original array. Let's just say I set that to 17. And let's just say I set this one to, we'll say -5. All right, because the entire array is sent by reference, changes that we make to it down in the function will change the original array that we created up in the main of our program. So if I run this again really quickly, all right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're seeing The 1 did not change. That was the one that I passed in by value and only changed by value. The 22 did change. That was the one I passed in by reference. And then all 3 of these changed because, again, I used the array to actually change those individual values. All right, so that's the main thing that you need to know going into this lab is, 1, when you're creating a function that's going to receive an array, we still need the type, we still need a name, and then you specify empty brackets. All right. When you're calling a function and sending an array, you just use the name of the array with no brackets, or you can send individual pieces if you don't want to send the whole thing. All right. When you send the whole thing, it's automatically by reference. So anytime I change ARR down in the function, it's also going to change the original array. When you send individual pieces, you can either send them by value or by reference, and then they follow all the same rules that we learned earlier in the course. All right. When you send something by value, changes don't affect the int main variables. When you send it by reference, they will affect those variables because they're sharing memory. Right? They're literally in the same spot on the computer, in the same memory cell. So changes to one will change the other. All right. So with that said, let's take a look at what you're actually going to be doing today. So if I head back over to the lab, you're going to see that, where are we? There it is. You are going to be adding features to the calculator. All right. So step 1 says write a function that will allow a user to enter up to 100 numbers. All right. And we're actually going to do this part together. We're going to add this to their calculator together. Step 2 is to add a function to your calculator that will allow them to basically calculate averages. All right. And you already wrote this code back in the first array lab. You've basically just got to move it over to your calculator and make any changes that are necessary so that it fits into your calculator. Step 3 is to set up a function that can do standard deviation. And if you're not familiar with that term, this will walk you through how it's actually calculated, but effectively it's a measure of how spread out your numbers are. And then step 4 refers to the 5-number summary. I'm actually going to have a separate video for that because it's a little more involved. So right now, let's just focus on allowing the user to enter numbers, setting up an average, and setting up a standard deviation. Now, again, this is not going to take place in that sample code we just looked at. You're going to go back to your original function calculator. So I'm going to back out of this. I'm going to find the function calculator that I've worked on twice before, and I'm going to open it up. All right, so this should have all of the stuff from the first 2 calculator labs: add, subtract, multiplication, division, and then exponent, factorial, and permutation. All right. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a function that's going to allow them to type in lots of numbers. All right, because right now we just only have this enter a number. We want them to be able to type in lots of numbers, and we're going to store those numbers inside of an array. All right, so I'm going to go down to my int main here where I have all my starting variables, number 1, number 2, answer, answer 2. And I'm going to create an array. All right, so this is going to be the general array that can be used by the calculator anytime somebody asks for an average or a standard deviation. So I'm going to say float calc array, because this one can handle decimals. I'm going to make it size 100, and I'm going to initialize it to 0. So at the start, it's 100 zeros being stored inside of a float array. All right. I am also going to create a variable for the size of the array. So when people are like, oh, I want to enter 10 numbers, or I want to enter 12 numbers, or I want to enter 13 numbers. And I'm just going to call that n, because in statistics, n is often used for the sample size. So we're going to use n here as the number of values the users decided to enter. And then the other thing that we're going to need is a lot of our answers in this lab involve decimals. So we can't use our answer 1 or our answer 2 here because those are only integers. I'm going to make a float variable called decimal answer that can store any decimal results, like when we're calculating an average or a standard deviation, right? Because if we try to put them in one of these two, the decimals will get cut off and that will cause problems. All right, so step 1 is just making these new variables, calc array, int n, float decimal answer. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go down and we're going to create a new function, all right? Because right now we have this function that says int enter a number. That's great for getting a single number, but we want to be able to enter lots of numbers and put them into our array. So I'm going to hit enter a couple of times. I'm going to say void enter many numbers, and then a left and a right parenthesis. Now, this is going to receive a few different variables. One, it's going to receive our array. So I'm going to just call it calc array again. Now, I don't need to put any number inside of those brackets, but I do need to have the empty brackets to designate that this is going to be an array. And then I'm also going to send in that variable n that we created as a reference variable. Whoops, and sign's on the wrong side there. All right, because we're going to need that value n all throughout our program. So we're going to have them enter it down in here, but we're going to need it in multiple locations. So we have to have that change reflected up in our int main. All right, so there's my curly braces. And inside of here, I'm basically just going to do what we did back in the array lab. I'm going to say cout how many numbers would you like to enter? I'm going to cin and put that value into n. All right. Once they've provided that value, I'm then going to set up my for loop just like I did in the array loops. So I'm going to make I right inside of here because I don't need it anywhere else. I'm going to say I less than whatever they just typed in. So I less than n. And I'm going to make I get 1 bigger each time. Okay. Hit enter, make my curly braces. And then I'll just put in a little statement here to get them started. So please enter element. Then I'll show them which one they're on. And then just is kind of formatting here, but I'll put a colon after that number and then a space. And then I'll actually let them type that in. So I'll do cin to calc array of I. Right? And again, because when you send an entire array, it's by reference, even though I'm typing in the numbers down here, all right, the changes will be reflected in my array in the int main. All right, same for n here because I made that a reference variable. All right, so this is a tiny little function whose only job is to ask them how many numbers they would like to enter, and then read in those numbers one by one into my array. All right, but again, setting up the function, I've got the empty brackets there, and then it's automatically by reference. So let me take this. Let me copy it up and add it to my other declarations. Okay. And now that I have this, I can now incorporate it into my calculator. All right, so I might want to add a new case. So I'm going to go below my permutation from the last lab, and I might say, all right, case A. And then I need to call that new function that I just created. So we called it enter many numbers. So enter many numbers. All right, it's expecting two things. It's expecting an array. So when I send the array, no brackets, just the name of the array. I'm sending the entire array, and it needs to know the sample size variable, so that's n. All right. So that's me calling the function so that they can type in several numbers. All right. Then I'm going to put in my break here so I don't forget that. So where you're going to pick up from is you're going to have like decimal answer equals, and then you're going to call your average function that probably is going to send calc array and n. All right. And then once it returns that value, you can print out the decimal answer the way you did before. You could have something like C out, the average of your numbers is, and then C out decimal answer like we did for all the other ones. All right. So that's kind of what you're going to be doing for this. And then also for the standard deviation. All right. You're going to have them type in a whole bunch of numbers. You're going to call your function. All right. That function is going to return a value that you're going to save in decimal answer. And then you're going to have an output statement where you actually tell them what they're getting. Now, I'm going to comment this out because I haven't actually written the code yet to do that. But if I run this, I just kind of want to show you what happens. So let me run this. All right, so if I say that I want to perform an average now, because that was the case I just made, it's going to ask me how many numbers I want to enter. So if I say 5, it's then just going to go through and let me enter, those 5 different numbers. All right. Now, at this point, it just asks me if I want to make another calculation because I haven't done it, but hopefully yours will eventually then print out the average. All right. So that's kind of what you need to know. How to set up a function that involves arrays. Just be aware that they're by reference, so we don't have to like add the and sign. It's like automatically there. So these changes that I'm making down here will also affect my array up top here. All right, so start with this, start with average, start with standard deviation. Once you get both of those working, you're welcome to come back to this come back to the assignment, and there's going to be another video that talks about how to do the 5-number summary, because that one's just a little trickier. So I'm going to put it in a separate video. All right. Have a great day. And as always, let me know if you have any questions. All right.